Butler, Heslop, and Kurth argue that overall internationally, teachers have a greater need than ever to act as materials designers. Teachers need to make materials that are appropriate and engaging for their students and help them learn English. They present a 10-step process that they use to innovate in their English teaching context. The authors provide a sketch of the curriculum integration process. It starts with a study of the student needs. They argue in their paper that students' needs today are various and are different than what are met by course books alone. They talk about the need for teachers to add to the course materials in the course book in order to provide units that are really relevant to the students. So their approach is not to throw out the course book, but to add to it gradually, little by little, based on students' needs. Now, their project doesn't talk about technology at all. That's what we need to add in for our course. So, in talking about each of these 10 steps, I'm going to do just that. I'll add the technology component. The first 3 steps are what I would call planning. This is where teachers look at students' needs. What are the students' needs with respect to both language and technology use? In our analysis, we need to think about the fact that a lot of language is used through technology today. And so, we need to consider language and technology needs for students' communication. The second step, preparing the goals and objectives, we need to ask this question. What language and technology skills will students learn as a result of the unit? So that's the basic goal setting. Third, developing test tasks. In their approach, they have the test tasks developed early on in the process. The test tasks allow the teachers to see what will be considered evidence of success of the new units. So to develop the new test tasks, the question is, what tasks will be used to evaluate students' accomplishments? And I would add, how will technology be used for these tasks to make them relevant to instruction? The next 2 steps I would call analysis. Identifying language and skills. What are the language and technology skills required for completing the task? These are analyzed by having teachers try out the tasks. This is a really important aspect of the process because the teachers develop the assessment tasks and then they actually do the assessment tasks themselves. This produces some very concrete knowledge about what's needed to be able to do these tasks, both with respect to language needs and the technology skills that are needed. The next step is sequencing. In what sequence should the teachers use these key components of language and technology skills? Once the skills are identified, how can they be divided up and taught gradually across a week or 2 weeks or however long that unit is going to last? The next 2 steps I would call development and use. What learning materials are needed to teach the unit? Materials include the language and the activities needed, as well as the technologies. Collaboration is critically important in developing the materials, and this is something that the authors emphasize, and we're going to hear our call expert emphasize as well, that collaboration among teachers is extremely important. The next step is teaching. Teachers try them out. How do the materials actually work in class? Teachers use the materials and note how students respond to them. An important aspect of teaching in this model is that teachers are not only teaching, but also carefully observing how the students respond. This is something that we do pretty naturally in the classroom. But in this case, these observations are going to be used later in this process. Teaching isn't the last step. It's only one part of the overall process. The last part I would call evaluation and revision, and it consists of 3 steps. The first is reflection, and that's the time for teachers to reflect on the experience of teaching the unit. Then comes evaluation. Teachers use the experience and reflection to evaluate the success of the teaching unit. Based on the evaluation, what revisions are needed? Are there any new or different technologies that should be incorporated to revise the unit? Can the technology be better used to meet the goals? Based on the use of the 10-step process, the authors argue that it's a very useful way of integrating something new into an existing curriculum. They point out that developing new units is a messy process, and I would certainly agree. The 10-step process provides some order. Developing new units is long and time-intensive, and the 10-step process allows for breaking up the process. The 10-step process is a cyclical one that allows for development of the units over several semesters. It includes time for reflection, evaluation, and improvement of units. They further point out that collaboration is key. Curriculum reform can fail without collaboration among teachers. Let's take a look at innovation in the creation of materials.